This virtual tour is brought to you by museumtours.co.il and your museum guide, Nachliel Selavan. I'd like to invite you to join our growing Facebook community, Museums, Fun and Learning, linked in the description below. Please also check out my podcast, Artifact Podcast, that's artifactpodcast.com, and look me up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and the Haps app. Make sure to check out the other videos on my YouTube channel, and remember to hit the subscribe button and smash that like button as much as possible. And now, let's go on a virtual journey. Welcome, everybody, to A Winter's Tale. I'm going to explain what the basic concept is, what the premise is, and then we're going to jump into it. So, the idea is that in the Jewish year, we're all about time, we're all about holidays. The biblical holidays, generally speaking, can be divided into agricultural holidays, which have to do with Chag HaKatzir, Chag HaAviv, Chag HaAsif. It's about different stages of agricultural processes, which once we are in Eretz Israel, in the land, as opposed to living in buildings and cities, it makes a lot more sense to us. We're familiar with it. We understand what it means to be the holiday of the spring or the holiday of the gathering. For example, on Sukkot, we understand what it means to be Zman Simchatenu, the time of our joy, because this is when we gather the final fruits of an entire year of work and we can come to the Beit HaMikdash and celebrate. So those were very intuitive. The other set of holidays has to do with time itself and some other events like Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. But generally speaking, we look at the holidays as the cycle of Shalosh Regalim, Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. We start with Pesach. So that takes us to our next point. Our next point is that there are added holidays throughout Jewish history. There's good ones and there's bad ones, right? There is Tisha B'Av, there's Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, Asar B'Tevet. Those are fast days which are centered around the destruction of the temple. There's Ta'anit Esther, which has something, it's related to the story of Purim. And then we have Hanukkah and Purim. Now, Hanukkah and Purim happen in the winter. And according to the cycle of the holidays, which begin with the spring, with Pesach, it's really, these are the last holidays of the Jewish year. A Winter's Tale focuses on those holidays which take place in the darkness, in the cold winter. And what I attempt to do is to show unique aspects of those two holidays, which we're going to call rabbinic holidays, as annoying and technical as that sounds, simply because they were established by rabbinic decree in one way or another, either that they are in the time Anshe Knesset HaGdolah, the men of the Great Assembly in the beginning of the Second Temple who instituted Purim, or we're talking about the later Second Temple period with Hanukkah. Both of those holidays happen in the winter, and they happen in reverse order chronologically than historically they took place. And I'm going to explain. Hanukkah happens chronologically after the story of Purim, but in terms of the year, it happens before. And so on this tour, I'm going to address it as coming before Purim, even though it really comes after Purim. And what I want to do is show unique aspects from each one of those holidays, historically, archaeologically, philosophically, and to wrap up with a beautiful message that we can take with us as an encouraging message of strength into the winter. And as we come around to spring, into Pesach, we will have that message with us. And so the last introductory line I'm going to say is that the idea of Pesach is a very earlier holiday. It's our childhood, right? We were a nation that was just born, just left Egypt, always complaining, always whining. We're kids. We're a bunch of kids. But it's also the beginning of the year. It's the new beginning. Now, if we could revisit our childhood with what we've learned and grown through in our lives, how would we do it over again? And that's the aspect of the cycle of the Jewish year that I want to focus on. What are we taking with us with Hanukkah and Purim and bringing into Pesach, which is a very simple holiday, spring, freedom. Hanukkah and Purim are very sophisticated holidays philosophically. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. And so that's what our journey is about, to explore those two things through history, archaeology, some exciting new museums that I've discovered, and of course, a lot of fun. A Winter's Tale, of course, is named after Mark Halpern's book, A Winter's Tale. When I have 2 hours to do this tour in the museum, I actually quote parts of the book, but we don't have the time for that now. And on a virtual tour, I like to keep text to a minimum. Okay, so with those words, welcome, Ella. So we are going to get started. So our story begins with Greece. So let's go to with Hanukkah. Let's go to our map. So what I did on this map is I actually laid out the points that are relevant to our story that we're going to take a look at based on the story of Hanukkah having to do with the miracle of the oil. So I made it in green. On Purim, there's a lot of drinking going around, so I did that in purple. And that's actually going to be the theme. I'm going to talk about Hanukkah in terms of olive oil, and I'm going to talk about Purim in terms of wine. And that's the philosophical aspect, which I'm going to be developing with you here. And hopefully by the end, we'll be able to put the two together and have a really beautiful message. So the story of Hanukkah. In order to understand the aspect of Hanukkah relevant to the message we want to take with us, we need to understand the core issue of the holiday from a philosophical point of view. And that actually has to do with philosophy itself. Philosophy comes from Greece. The Greeks brought philosophy to the world. You can, in fact, say that that's the West, right? It began in Greece, and that, of course, has to do with Athens and wisdom, libraries, the Olympic Games, aesthetics, poetry, the symposium, all of those different things that we've gone into a little bit more depth when we did the Hanukkah tour, right? So we're going to have a little bit of overlap, but obviously it's going to be from a new perspective. So we're going to be looking at museums that if you've been with me on Hanukkah, we've gone to, but going to different parts of the museum. So it's going to be new. Okay, so let's talk about olive oil. So olive oil is, as far as we know, was cultivated for the first time about 5,000 years ago in the island of Crete. So this is the island of Crete. It's one of the Greek islands. And in fact, in mainland Greece, which has the proper climate and terrain for growing olives, this became one of the ancient empires of growing olive trees in the ancient world, to the point where the very famous Athenian Greek legislator Solon in the 6th century, 2,500 years ago, made a legislation for the protection of the olive tree in Greece under law. So it's a big deal. The olive tree in Greece is a very, very big deal. Okay. So here's a couple other points we're going to look at. There's 2 points here. I mean, I have a lot of different things going on, but I want to take you, first of all, to the place where we can say is the birthplace of Greek philosophy and what Greece brings to the world. And that, of course, is Athens. So let's go to Athens. Okay. Welcome to Athens. We have been warped to another continent. So you're looking at the Acropolis. The Acropolis is one of the more impressive temple structures of the ancient world. It was built to withhold earthquakes. In other words, if it shakes, the pillars are built in such a way that they can move and it still stays. Now, just by glancing at this, you're looking at some very Greek contributions to the world. You're looking at several amphitheaters. There's the Theater of Dionysus. There are several temples here as well. If you move out, there is a horse race track, which is for the Olympic Games as well. And this has to do with what Greece brought to the world. Greece brought us culture. They brought us, we can say now every country has a different culture, but the concept of culture itself, which is something that is celebrated and fought for, is something which is very, very Greek. And they brought that into the world. That's really what the West is. The West, it has its underpinnings, its roots in ancient Greece itself. So this is also even to the point of the architecture. Every major museum in the world looks like the Greek Acropolis, right? Down here is the Museum of the Acropolis. We might get to jump in there for a few minutes just for fun. Okay, so this is Greece. Now, what's important for us there is the history of Athens and the olive tree. So in ancient cultures, it is there's always legends around the invention of wine, olive oil, fire, bread. How did we get all of these things? There's always going to be some sort of story. The mythology, that's what mythology really is. Mythology in the sense of an origin story, not as a historic truth. A mythology is an attempt to give an explanation to where something came from and how it connects to us, and it's part of our heritage, right? That's the idea of what we call origin stories. That's the aspect of mythology that I'm referring to. I'm not talking right now about the gods, Zeus and the Titans and Heracles and all that stuff. The origin story of Athens, being called Athens, comes from Greek mythology, in a story which talks about a competition, of course, because Greeks, a competition between various gods over who shall be the patron god of the inhabitants of the city of Athens. So you have Poseidon, who's the god of the ocean, who strikes a rock and out comes gushing water, which represents the power of maritime trade, because Greece is islands, and their power is in the ability to trade with ships, right? Then there is Zeus, who has the power of horses, and then there is Athena, who takes her lance and slams it into the ground, and out comes the olive tree. So I want to show you an image of that. Here we go. So let's talk about Athena for a moment. Okay, so on the right-hand side is a picture from a Greek amphora, from a vase, which shows you Athena with her lance struck into the ground, and out comes the olive tree. She gave the olive tree as a gift to the Athenians. Now, they accepted her gift over that of Poseidon, who was very, very angry and wanted to destroy them, yada, yada. So they had to build a temple to appease him too. This is fun Greek mythology, English literature 101, 9th, 10th grade in America. It's standard. I didn't learn this in school. So Athena gives them the olive tree, and they choose the olive tree. And I like to give the metaphor of Shel Silverstein's book, which some people find traumatizing, The Giving Tree. In the giving tree, there's this tree which throughout every stage of the life of the child who loves the tree is giving to the child. He's giving him branches to climb on. He's giving him fruit. He's giving him shade. He's giving him wood. And eventually the tree ends up giving its life for the child and dies, because the child chopped him off to make a house and all that. But the idea is that the tree has a lot of utility. The olive tree has many different utilities. It's good for shade. It's good for the fruit. It's good for the olive oil. And if you know a little bit of science today, it's also good for the atmosphere. But they didn't know that back then. It takes the carbon dioxide and emits oxygen into the atmosphere. So that's the olive tree. The olive tree, we'll talk a little bit more about the olive tree, but I want to talk about Athena right now. So Athena here is on a Greek amphora. We'll be talking a lot about Greek amphora, Greek vases. They're very, very important. This is an image of Athena as well. And this is something which it was a gift. This amphora, it was a gift to the Olympic champions in the Olympic Games. So if you would win the Pan-Athenaic Games, which means the games relating to all the nations around Athens, this would be the gift that you would get if you would win the games. Sometimes you would even get 5 tons of olive oil, right? Which means you would be obscenely rich. It's like winning the Oscars, right? Except more. And on the left here is a typical coin of Athens, which if you look carefully at the letters, alpha, theta, epsilon, it says Athe. It's short for Athena. It's not AOE, right? It's short for Athena. There's Athena on the left wearing her helmet, and there is an owl and a little tiny budding olive branch to the top left right next to the owl. Now, let me say something about the owl and Athena. So just to bring us up to speed, I see that some people are smiling and no, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, in Egyptian, in Greek mythology, Athena represents wisdom, warfare, craftsmanship, and the arts. So the idea of wisdom has a lot to do with Athena. And so her bird, which is the owl, became the symbol of wisdom. You know this from Winnie the Pooh. You have Errol the owl. The owl is the wise bird because it's the bird of Athena. So that's how much that trickled down. And then there's the olive tree. So what does the olive have to do with Athena and with wisdom? That's going to be something we're going to be talking about throughout this tour. But I want to mention before we jump back in to Athens is that Hanukkah is about olive oil from the Jewish side. And yet we are dealing with the Greeks whose wisdom, whose foundation in Athens, like the famous book Athens and Jerusalem, right, is all about Athena and wisdom, and that relates to olive oil. So that's something that should, I guess, lubricate our thoughts if we're speaking of oil, because it's very much related. Okay. So now I want to take us to, first of all, just to show you a cool, I was just looking this up, the history of the olive tree. So I got this beautiful picture here of a massive olive tree. And this tree is very, very old. An olive tree can reach thousands of years of age. And that's one of the reasons that the olive branch, the olive tree, is the symbol of peace in Jewish history and in Greek thought. So for the Jews, we have the olive branch of the dove, of Yonah. And for the Greeks, we have the olive tree because it lasts for a very long time, as should peace, right? So olive tree was basically the first peace in the Middle East, you can say, but just the tree. So, and I'm gonna, if I said philosophical, I'll throw you another fun idea, is that the olive branch of Yonah is the feminine of Yon, which can be read Yavan. In other words, Yonah, Yavan, olive branch, olive tree. There's a lot of fun things going on there. And I just wanted to sort of enlighten with that. But you can see here that this is, here it says here, definitely Greece is just the credit line for this picture. And this is all about Greece. Look at this mainland Greece. You're seeing beautiful olive groves. I'm a painter, so I can tell the color of an olive tree from far away, from, doing a lot of landscape. Olives, and this is a cookbook. So, I mean, this is a cooking blog. So I thought that was really neat. Okay. So that was the first aspect of Greece. Let's get into another aspect. So I just discovered through reading today that there is a museum of the olive and the Greek olive oil in Sparta. To quote Leonidas in that movie 300, this is Sparta. We are now in Sparta, and we can actually go into this museum. So let's take a look at it. Okay, here we are. I'm sharing this excitement with you. This is the first time this is the first time I've heard of this museum today as well. So I love what I do. Okay, here's the museum. Now, to jump into the museum, you have to take a leap of faith because not all of the spots tell you they're available. Okay, so we're inside the museum. This looks like where there's some kind of presentation. People sit down. Olive trees, of course. We're in Sparta. We're in Greece. Okay. And you're seeing the history of the olive press, the making of the olive press. These are stones that are used to press down, to weigh down and crush the olives. We have the story of Hanukkah, where it takes 8 days to collect the highest quality oil. And that's because when you crush the olives, you're seeing in the image here, you can look carefully. Okay, you know what? We got zoomed into the museum. That's fine. Here, this is a more modern press, but you can see that there's a place for pressuring olives, right? This is a much more modern one, but it's the same idea. When you crush the olive, there's a kind of liquid that comes out at first, which is not the one you want. You need to get rid of that. The olive oil floats on top of that, and then you gather the olive oil. And if you want to get the proper oil, it's the optimal, and you need the optimal amount of pressure not to damage the olive. And you have to make sure that it drips and you collect it at the right time without too much of the bad stuff. So it's a very delicate process. And to get the right amount, it does indeed take a long time, especially if you want the best type of olive oil, the finest olive oil. So we're inside the museum. This part is a little more modern. It's not as interesting to us in terms of our story, but I want to take us to some interesting places. Okay. All right. This is the best place to be. We're floating in the middle of the air. So you can see all this olive press going on down there. There's a whole display. If this was in Israel, the kids would probably dress up in costume and also, take part and act it out dressing biblically. Okay. Boring. Okay. I'm looking for one spot, so bear with me for a moment. Here we are. So you can't move around that much in here. That's the thing about this museum. It's very, very restrictive. But here's what I wanted to show you. So hold on. Is this it? I'll be right there. There's a part here with the history, and there's very few options, so we're going to find it. Ta-da, ta-da. Here we go. Wonderful. So remember I said we're going to talk about Greek vases. We're going to see more of them, but here's one. Now this, unfortunately, we can't get too close, but if I just show you around, you'll see that there's a plaque here that talks about the history of ancient Greece and how they stored olive oil. It's probably talking about the Olympics. We're going to see the Olympics up close in another museum. So this is just, but you get the idea. If you're going to talk about the history of olive oil, guaranteed you're going to talk about the Olympics, right? Here's how it's used for light. There's all kinds of lamps. Really, really neat. Amphorae and Greek history. Now, here's what I want to talk about the Olympics for a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit more about the Olympics in another museum. So this amphora is showing you a lot of people running. One of the Olympic Games, of course, was that 100-meter dash, right? The story of marathon running comes from the Battle of Marathon against the Persians. So that distance that was run by the soldier, the messenger who was talking about the Greeks coming and then he dies, right, as he gives the message, that's the distance, about 40 kilometers. That's the distance of the marathon. So that's just a fun fact. So a gift like this, an amphora like this, was given as a gift to the champion of the Panathenaic Games. In other words, the Olympics, played by Mount Olympus, where they believed the gods resided. So they're doing this in honor of the gods. And this is a fun idea. The study of ancient Greek vases is a very, very respected topic. There's a lot to learn about them, how you make them. It's very hard to forge them. You can earn knighthood by studying Greek amphora. You can go to jail for stealing them. It's a big, big deal. They're constantly coming up. I think around Hanukkah time, there was a whole horde of Greek vases that was smuggled into Israel and was on the news. It's a big deal. Now, this Greek vase was probably given as a gift to a running champion because you're seeing people running on it. And these were inscribed. They were made by very well-respected potters who would make them. And this is putting olive oil in an Athenian jar like this, in an amphora, is the first product certification in the world. This is product certification. It's authentic. It's in a Greek vase, right? As we say, vasneus, for those who speak Yiddish. So that was for you, Moshe David. Okay, so this was given to the Olympic champions. Now, the Olympic champions would actually rub their bodies in olive oil in order to have the gifts of Athena. That was considered to be to get all the strength and power of warfare, battle, and all that stuff to win. That's the goddess of warfare. So they would cover themselves in olive oil for that purpose. It also makes it a little bit harder when it comes to wrestling. There's Greek wrestling, pankration, where they put on themselves olive oil, and it's also very healthy too. But that's another story. Okay, so this was the Museum of the olive oil and the olive tree in Sparta. I think it's cool that such a museum exists, and hopefully soon Greece will be able to visit soon. You talk about a green passport and olive oil. Okay, now we are going to go to our next museum, my second favorite museum in the United States, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Now, if you were with me on the Hanukkah tour, we were upstairs. We spoke about Greek amphora, about the Iliad, the Odyssey. We spoke about Greek philosophy, mythology, the symposium, drinking wine. Here we're going to focus on warfare and on the Olympics. And that's going to be a very important part of our story. So, Greek art. And here is the warrior in the Greek world. So we're going to look at some warfare. This is a shield. This is probably part of body armor. And there's a little more body armor here. Just get a good view. See these helmets, a sword, dagger, little statuettes, which were probably carried of warriors, but Greek warriors and even Romans would carry around little statuettes of their own idolatry that they would take with them for protection, for prayer. And on these Greek vases of various types, this is called a helix. It's used for drinking wine. It's a flat bowl for drinking wine. We'll see more of that when we talk about wine. Here's Athena. Here's warriors. Here's warriors preparing for war. And of course, Athena is there in the background. She's probably a hologram while they're there in the locker rooms. And here is Athena probably, or someone giving something to a soldier, who knows what it is. But you see a soldier, a scene that has to do with battle. Here is a shin guard. So this is warfare. Warfare in ancient Greece was very different than it was in any other country at the time. This is recorded in the histories with the Persian Wars with Herodotus, where he describes the difference between the Persian warriors and the Greek warriors. The Persian warriors were very colorful, very exotic. They had soldiers from all over the world. I mean, the Persian Empire was a very cosmopolitan empire. They really liked showing off with the diversity of the empire, right? In many different ways. So they did that in warfare. But the Greeks had a standard armor for different strata of society. So you can be a hoplite, you can be a foot soldier, but if you had an estate, you could have a horse. There's a lot of politics behind that. But going to war was an honor. And dying in battle, especially in Sparta, was glory. As the saying as the famous saying of Sparta goes, either come home with your shield or on it, right? That means you're dead, you're being brought home on your shield. Dying in warfare and glory has a lot to do with the main idea of Hanukkah, which clashed with us when we met the Greeks, which had to do with, we fought them with battle, but our idea of battle wasn't to win, was to stand up for our ideals or die for them. That's the idea of glory that we're talking about. So there's the glory of Greece and there's the glory of Hanukkah. And we're going to talk about that when we wrap up Hanukkah and Greece and olive oil. So this is warfare. The next stop here is going to be the Olympic Games. Let's jump ahead. We're making the jump. Here we go. Okay, the Olympic Games. I have to jump through a wall. Will I make it? I made it. Okay. What was this? The Greek athlete, yada, 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 yada. So Greek athletics, the Olympics. So some of you, by the way, have been with me at the Met in the Hanukkah tour, where I show you the discus that is thrown. And I mentioned that this was found in the tomb of an athlete. And there were two of these, they're decorative. They weren't the actual discus you'd throw. This one is made from marble, right? It had two. The second one is in the MFA. Here it is. The second one's in Boston, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Okay, so here it is. It has the guy's name on it. And this is all about the Olympics. So let's talk about the Olympics. First of all, what? So these are little bronze statues of Olympic competitors. And on the very bottom is what's called a strigil and arabellus. What it is it's a little vial for olive oil and a scraping knife. Now, remember that the athletes would compete covered in olive oil. They would also compete naked, because what they're doing is honoring the gods by showing the human body's capabilities. Look how far I can run. Look how well I can play my instrument. Look how well I can jump. They would compete over anything competable under the sun. This is what the Greeks basically invented competition and the Olympic Games. That's one of their contributions to the world. Now, when you're rolling in the dirt and you're naked and you're covered with olive oil, I think it's safe to say that you're going to look like schmutz. Right? So these scrapers were used to scrape off the olive oil and the grit and grime from your body, but that's where we would end it. They actually collected that gooey olive oil and would auction it. And that was considered to be a very big deal. Look, I have the champion's own sweat, the champion's own olive oil. Let me put on a little bit before that, special date, maybe sprinkle some for good mazel, as they say, for good luck on your food. I mean, by all standards of today, that's disgusting. But back in the day, I mean, you didn't exactly have clean tap water. So the standards were a little bit different. So this is part of their ritual. And here's different things they're competing in. Probably throwing some sort of knife, not really sure. Let's take a look. Javelin throwers. I don't know. And discus throwers, of course. I'll say a fun thing about also horse races as well. Here's like a part of a wheel or something. These are little models, right? So this is all about the Olympics. Now, the idea of celebrating the Olympics on these vases, of course, we spoke about this on the Hanukkah tour, is the idea of telling the story and making sure to convey the story visually, because we learn from pictures. We're visual people. The Greeks told a lot of stories, right? The Greeks were famous for memorizing 17,000 words in poems. Like we think, oh, I need to write things down. People had very, very good memories before they started writing down. If I might mention, I think it was either Plato or Socrates who lamented what's going to happen to people's memories once they start writing things down. Like Socrates never wrote down his stories. It's his student Plato who wrote all about it, right? So it was probably Socrates. We feel like, oh, oral tradition, shmoral tradition. People really remembered things in ways that we don't understand unless you meet Yemenites who like remember everything, right? So because they really just repeat and learn. So, but the idea of having pictures is telling a story. This is what we glorify. This is what we celebrate, right? So that's a lot of the idea of Greece. Now, I want to wrap this up and talk about Hanukkah in terms of olive oil, and then we're going to move on to talk about Purim. So to wrap this up, the idea of the olive oil, the idea of Greece really all has to do with wisdom, with philosophy, with glory, right? If we could summarize that into one idea and how that relates to Athena, Athens, the olive tree, olive oil, it has to do with potential. There is potential energy, which is now going to burst into light or into flame. And through competing, I am showing the potential of humanity. Look what we can achieve. It's potential, right? And then philosophy is light, is wisdom. All of these ideas tie down to the olive tree. So the olive tree very much represents ancient Greece and very much has to do with Hanukkah and with the idea of having potential, which comes bursting into light. And this is where the Jewish story comes in, because the concept of the Hashmonaim is to stand up for something that matters, even if I'm not going to win. They weren't expecting to win this battle against the Greeks. That came out of left field. They're like, wait, now what? Now we have a full-fledged battle on our end. Okay, I guess we're going to fight this one through. But it wasn't part of the plan. They definitely did not think it was going to work. They just said, we can't live like this. We need to live the way we need to, that expresses who we are, or die trying. And that's the idea of Hanukkah, where the potential comes out in flame, bursts out, and that's our glory. And the Hebrew word for glory is hod. And so on Hanukkah, we say lehodot ulehalel, to express that which has been revealed, right, which has been glorified. Lehodot, hoda'ah, and that has a lot to do with the olive oil and the miracle of the oil. So it's very befitting that the miracle of Hanukkah, which has to do with the clash against a different culture, which is trying to extinguish our light in a sense, is expressed through olive oil. It made a lot of sense at the time, and it's very special. Okay. Now we're going to move on to talk about Purim. I just want to show you a few slides, which are kind of fun. So this is the royal treasure of Philip of Macedonia, who's the father of Alexander the Great. This was found. This is incredible. This is the royal jewelry of the king of Philip of Macedonia, the father of Alexander. And here is a wreath of an olive branch, which was found, which he wore on his head. So just to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this is an olive branch, an olive wreath, and this is what was given as an honor to the Olympic champions because it has to do with wisdom and Athena and so on. So this is the olive wreath, and here is a gold statue of Alexander the Great wearing an olive wreath. So it all comes together. Now let's talk about Purim. Purim, we're going to talk about in terms of wine, even though the Greeks really perfected the art of drinking wine that has to do with philosophy. Again, we did that on the Hanukkah tour. That's a story for another time. I want to talk about Purim. So Purim, as the quote I brought here is, we have a mandate to drink on Purim until you can't tell the difference between who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. In other words, it gets really ambivalent. It's murky. It's blurry. They're all they're all players. They're all players in the game, right? So that's the source that I have here. Now, if we think about wine, what exactly is wine? Why is wine important to us? What does wine do? Right. So let's think about all the places in Jewish tradition, right, in ritual that we use wine. And perhaps ritual is the most key word because you can barely think of a Jewish ritual that doesn't involve doing something with wine, whether it's giving wine to an 8-day-old baby or drinking wine at the wedding or, wine at Friday night or wine kiddush, wine havdalah, right? There's always going to be wine, and that has nothing to do with Jews whining about things. So we have a lot of wine involved, and wine. My father told me growing up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as a kid, wine was Manischewitz. Wine was that sweet, sugary thing that you use for sacrament. It's not something that you sit back and enjoy and smell the wine and have it with meat and like that was very detached from traditional Jewish culture for years because the Jewish production of wine has been sort of lost. It's revived now in Israel. It's very, very sophisticated. Israel is winning gold medals against century-old French vineyards now. But wine is a very important part of Jewish tradition, right? Even if it's just for sacrament. In many places that aren't privy to kosher wine, they're like, I guess wine isn't tasty. I don't enjoy wine, but wine is supposed to be enjoyed. Okay. So these are 2 golden drinking cups from the Persian Empire, from Shushan, from Persepolis. I want to take us into a museum to talk about wine, but I'm going to put a little bit of an interesting twist on this. So all of this starts, one second, I'm in the wrong, here we go. Okay. So I'd like to take you, of course, to the British Museum because I love that museum and there's a lot of stuff to see there. But before I do that, I want to take you to an unexpected place. Before we go into the British Museum, I am now taking you to Nimrud. I'm taking you to Kalach. This is an ancient city. It's mentioned in Tanakh in the Bible as Kalach, right next to Nineveh. We are in Iraq. And here is the Northwest Palace of King Ashur-nasir-pal. King Ashur-nasir-pal built this palace. We're talking about 2,870 years ago or 90 years ago. This is the largest party ever recorded in ancient history. Okay, the party of the inauguration of the palace of Ashur-nasir-pal in Kalach. Today it's called Nimrud. Okay, now I'm going to show you what's from this palace in the British Museum, but I want you to get the idea of what we're talking about. This is a massive palace complex of the emperor of the Assyrian Empire. All right. So now I'm going to take you you're going to dive into the British Museum, and I'm going to show you something that comes from here. So welcome to the British Museum once again. And we are looking at the relief panels from the palace of King Ashur-nasir-pal, who is celebrating the inauguration of the palace, and he writes about it and he brags about it. And here is the picture I want to show you. So in this record, he describes how he had all this luxurious food and meat and tens of thousands of this and that and barrels of whiskey, which was the traditional intoxicating drink of Mesopotamia, all brought in. But what took the place of honor and stole the show was the fact that he had, I think he records 10,000 wineskins. Right? That's how you transport wine skins. That was the big deal. Why is that the big deal? Because wine was 10 times more expensive than whiskey, than they didn't have whiskey, than beer, than mead. Wine was very difficult to get in this part of the world, and wine was, because it was so expensive and hard to transport, it was considered to be a luxury to even have it. He was showing off saying, I have so much wine that look what I've been able to do, because it's the Assyrian Empire with their sophisticated trading networks, right? And commerce. So this is the idea. Now here is King Ashurnasirpal sitting on his throne with servants fanning him all over, and he's holding a small, probably golden little fiale, a little bowl with wine, which you would probably sip a little bit of. Now, this is not unusual to see an Assyrian king standing in some sort of ritual holding wine. But what the Assyrians did in the world is they turned wine drinking into elaborate formal ritual. Very different from the Greeks. The Greeks had to do with philosophy, the symposium, right? That's not what we're talking about. They made wine a little bit more available. Then came the Babylonians, and then came the Persians. That takes us into the story of Persia. So now I want to take us to the story, which has to do, of course, with our king, Achashverosh, with our story of Purim, and with wine. Okay? So we're back to our map, and I'm showing you now the Zagros Mountains. We don't really know where wine came from. There are studies which say that it started in the Neolithic area. We're talking like 9,000 years ago, right? But generally speaking, it's accepted from archaeological evidence as far as 5,000 years ago or more that it started here in the Zagros Mountains, which is in the corresponds more or less with Armenia and northern Iran. Now, here's a beautiful story. In Jewish tradition, where do we see wine show up the first time? We have Noah. Very good. We have Noah. Right. Noah comes off the Teva, which was in Mount Ararat in Armenia, in this area, this more or less this mountain range, a little closer to Turkey, but also Armenia. And he comes down and he drinks wine. That's our origin story that has to do with wine, right? But the Persians have their own, but the point is that we know that it came from this part of the world, which is really neat. So the Persians had access to wine. For the Persians, it wasn't a big deal. It's cheaper, right? It's like going and buying that, I don't know what you're going to say. It's like, I'm thinking of like an American brand that's much cheaper in Israel, in America than it is in Israel. Like you look in Israel, you look at Mamilla, and you're like, there's a North Face there. Like I'm going to look, and I'm going to shop in America because it's way too expensive here. Wine was very, very expensive everywhere in the world, but it started in ancient Persia and the Zagros Mountains. This is the origins of where wine comes from. Just like the olive tree comes from Crete. That's where olive oil originally came from. Wine originally came from ancient Persia, which is really neat. Okay, so this is where it starts. And then we have the Palace of Shushan right here. And you see how close it is to the Zagros Mountains. We just visit the Palace of Shushan. We've been to the museum in Tehran. We've done a lot of fun stuff on the Purim tour. But here's where this part is a little bit shorter. Okay, so we're not going to have that much, moving around. I'm going to take you to our lovely the British Museum. Hold on. So here we have, this is just Shushan. This is where the palace happens, where we have the drinking of wine and the story of Esther. All that's happening here, which is not far from where the wine was originally produced. I mean, at this point, it was produced also in Egypt and in different parts north of Israel, but it was still very difficult to produce. It was still very, very expensive. And now we're back at the British Museum. So I'm going to end here at the British Museum. I want to take us one more time into the Persian Empire and talk about the drinking of wine. So here's all our fancy vessels for drinking wine. Now, one of the things that had to happen in order for winemaking to exist is the invention of pottery. In other words, before humanity learned how to harness fire and to bake clay, you couldn't have wine because wine cannot be stored in gold and silver, which is why the Greeks made fun of the Persians for drinking out of gold and silver as the Persians did. They drink out of clay because that preserves the flavor of the wine, right? So several different things had to happen in order for winemaking to be possible. And then there's, of course, transporting the wine by ships. I mean, there's a lot of history on the transportation of wine. If you're interested in general in learning about the history of wine, there's a great book. I can send you a link later. It's called The History of the World in Six Glasses. And there's a lot of history about wine. I love the book, and I definitely recommend it. I used it extensively for preparing these tours. And it's a fun read. So go look for that. The History of the World in Six Glasses by Tom Standage. Here's the book right in front of me. The History of the World in Six Glasses. So for fun, no, we don't have time to talk about it. Short on time. Okay. So let's talk about the Persians. Okay. So there's drinking wine here, right? And there is, here we go. I'm taking you back to the slideshow. So to the slide. So here's a drinking bowl, like we saw the king holding one up in his hand. We saw these clay drinking vases from the Greeks, and here's all the menagerie of the Persian feast of drinking wine, the drinking festival, right? And this is what we find in the palace. We find the story that everyone can drink whatever they want in the story of Purim. Now, I'd like to take us into a beautiful idea, a little bit of a philosophical idea, which has to do with wine, in order to wrap this up. And in order to do that, I'm going to take you into the story of Purim, into a critical moment, which kind of perhaps goes over our head. We don't really appreciate what it means. Okay, so I want to take us into this story. So first of all, wine. So this quote here from Masechet Brachot, from Tractate Brachot in the Talmud, talks about wine in terms of the world to come. And that's a beautiful idea to keep with us. It says that all of the prophets were talking about, in the very best, they were talking about the days of the Messiah, the end of days. They're talking about human history and developments in human history. Nothing, too out there, nothing like the world to come. It's just this world and things working out a certain way. But the world to come, Ain lo rata Elohim zolatecha, nobody but God has seen it, and that's going to be there for those who are waiting for it. And so this is the quote I want us to think about. What is this? Let me put it here in English as well. That there is this wine that has been preserved in its grapes since the 6 days of creation, which no eye has ever seen. A special wine preserved from the 6 days of creation, and no one has ever seen it. And the celebration of the culmination, the end of the unique story of human history, how it develops, is going to be celebrated in terms of wine. And here is the beautiful story. So first of all, I'm going to take you to the story in the Megillah, and then we're going to wrap up the idea. So this is the critical moment. I have it in Hebrew and then in English. A critical moment where Mordechai is trying to plea that Esther should go in and talk to the king and persuade him to cancel the evil decree of Haman to kill all the Jews. And then she says to him, the king's kind of paranoid, and if I get any close to him, he's going to shoot me, even if I'm his own queen. And I haven't heard anything from the king in 30 days. It's not a good idea to go in there. There's not a lot of good chances, right? So he basically, she basically says to him, listen, Mordechai, or Uncle Morty, the chances of this plan to succeed are zilch, are nil, right? There's really no chance that this is going to succeed. Now, what would you expect him to say? Listen, Esther, it's not about you. It's about the Jewish people. It's like the Ancient One tells Dr. Strange, it's not about you, right? There's a bigger picture. She says, if all of this rests on the chance of one in a million that this might work, and otherwise it's all over and the Jewish people are gone, then it must not really matter. It can't all be about this, right? It has to be that it can't be all resting on this chance. And this is where Mordechai has a wake-up moment, an aha moment, and he goes, you know what? You're right. By all means, don't go into plea. If you, but this is the famous, but if you remain silent, you might get away, living in the palace. But at the end of the day, you and your family line will be gone from history and will be insignificant and won't matter. And what's going to be with the Jews? Relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, whatever that means. But if we think about, wait a minute, what does it mean? It's mind-blowing. He's saying, you know what, Esther? You are 100% correct. We don't need you. You need you. If you don't do this, we will survive. I don't know how. It's going to come from another place. Who knows what's going to happen? It's sort of like in Asimov's Foundation, making a very long story short, there's this discussion about, there's this prophecy of the Foundation is going to make it through no matter what. So this general of the wants to attack the Foundation. He says, are you basically saying that no matter what I do, I don't stand a chance to defeat the Foundation? He goes, yep. So by all means, I'm going to destroy them. And every step that he took in order to make sure that he can destroy them ended up being his undoing. Now let's go to Purim. Every step that Haman, the advisor of the king, took to set himself up to such a position that the king will be so dependent on him that he ends up being paranoid. And then it's because of him that he gets rid of Vashti. And then Esther comes in, and now he invites Esther to the party. And now the king's like, but what's going on? Is there something going on with Haman and Esther? And he can't sleep at night. And he's like, he's about to explode. And then she says, it's all him. It's like, there's so many crazy things going on, but Haman was his own doing. Everything that he did to set himself in the position of power ended up being his undoing. He was the architect of his own demise. It's incredible. So the idea that is expressed here is things are going to work themselves out. If it is true that the Jewish people are an integral part of the story of creation, the history of of humanity, it's gonna work out. We don't need you, but who knows? Perhaps you have attained the royal position just for such a crisis. This is your moment. It's for you. So here is where the story of Purim and wine comes out. And I want to wrap this up. Why is wine so important to us? Why is wine considered to be the most sophisticated of human drinks? Much more than whiskey, right? Why is it? I love whiskey, by the way. But why is this? Because wine is the only drink where a good connoisseur will taste a particular vintage and will be able to tell you where it's from, when it's from, what was the altitude, the terroir, the minerals in the ground. Is this a single vineyard, which means it's only Cabernet, or are there other vineyards around it? Are there fruits next to it? Was it impacted by the pollen? Was it picked during the day? Was it picked at night? Right? There's so many different aspects which are unique, and they give a unique flavor to the wine, and you can never replicate that. So when you say this was the 2008 Cabernet Franc from, Napa Valley, like that, you can't reproduce that. And that's why the value is so high. And I just made up those figures. But the point is that you can never replicate it because no year is the same. And the unique history of the grapevine, from the temperature to the altitude to the sunlight to when it was picked to what's growing next to the composition of the earth, the terroir, are all reflected in a glass of wine. And this is where I bring us back to this idea of the entirety of history being expressed in a wine which is ready to drink at the end. Because this is what wine is. Wine is a unique history which could have happened in an infinite different number of ways. This is the way it turned out. What Mordechai is telling Esther is, this is the way history is going to turn out with you. Without you, it's going to turn out another way. So you are adding to the story, and that's making it your story. You are now a part of it because of what you're doing. We don't need you. You want to be part of the story. This is your opportunity. This is your story. And so I want to wrap this up and to talk about Hanukkah and Purim as the winter's tale going into the spring, the holidays of darkness. Darkness is a difficult time, right? Philosophically, metaphorically, but also physically, spiritually, it's darkness, right? These are two very difficult periods in Jewish history. We're in the dark. There's no miracles, right? We're on our own, so to speak. We're out in Persia, or you're invaded by the Greeks. It's in the winter. It's dark. It's not a coincidence. And yet there's an important strength that comes out of those holidays. In Hanukkah, we have olive oil, we have energy. We have the energy which comes out in potential to do, to express, to have glory, to shine. In Purim, we have the ability to contribute to the story and add to it and make it our own by playing our part for our sake, so that we are part of the story and it has our unique flavor. And so olive oil, Hanukkah, is energy and potential. Purim is uniqueness and history and our unique choices. And taking those two strengths with us can help us recognize our own strength. And now we can survive the darkness and then come into the spring renewed with new energy and new strength and new abilities. This was A Winter's Tale. Thank you so much. And I will say now, I'm just going to stop the recording, but if there are any questions or